You're using the word influence. It reminds me that you at one point argued that there's a difference between accusing speculation and you say, no, I mean, sir, that's based on evidence. Based on
that's the difference between speculation and influence.
Yeah, based on evidence. And so I want to say that what you call influence is actually speculation.
All right.
I'll
accept that. Right, to maintain
in
what
line
I
with
said
your
about
thinking,
influence.
in line with your
True.
own thinking. But I have another problem with the study of music. The study of music.
I have problems with that.
Yeah. Precious age problem, and I want to make it clear. You talk at one point, and what you did, that everything has to be contextualized in a broader sense. I mean, there are many agents who participate in whatever takes place in music and the performance and the action in every which I fully endorse. There's only when you talk about that one has to do away with the separating lines or whatever it is between ethnomusicology and musicology, and the way, let's say, like music between chap versus ethnomusicology, even though there's a big difference because the anthropological emphasis in ethnomusicology versus comparative, which is the systems, but that's beside the point. But the problem is, and I agree, contextualization is a major factor, and therefore we look at what they thought and we have to have evidence and so on, see the interrelationship. But when I think, for example, of just Elio and I wrote a little piece trying to show that there's a difference between multiculturalism and cultural, what do you call it? Cultural relativism versus multiculturalism. Cultural relativism told us that you don't interpret, let the culture dictate what they think, what they understood thereby, and so on. Clifford Gilson, the whole group. Multiculturalism nowadays makes it very difficult to find the context. I mean, where in, because we want to understand, what is it that we are doing? Well, okay, genres is a separate thing. That is still possible to handle. But everything that takes place, all the mixtures that take place, and everything, I'm not only talking about world music, but everything, the soundscape and so on. Now, my question is, how do we study? How do we contextualize?
How do we contextualize everything?
Because on the one hand, McLuhan was right, it's a village. On the other hand, there's more.
But this is why the book you write will not be the same as the book I write. Because none of us takes in everything. We are, to an extent, consciously, but not entirely consciously, selective. And that's part of what being meaningful is. We talk about what's meaningful to us. And so my perspective is partly constrained or enabled by the things that I'm observing, but also is constrained by my own limitations, right? So I look at it in a certain partial way, you look at it in another partial way. If we compare our work, we might find a third way that is less partial. So maybe I'm describing some kind of a dialectic here. But this is how it seems to me we approach something that we'll all agree is approximates to accuracy. The question about convergence of musicology and ethnomusicology, I hate putting it that way. Musicology should contain ethnomusicology. So what I usually do is I say there's ethnomusicology and then there's unprefixed musicology, which is also a dodge. There's no way around this. But I wouldn't agree that I say we must do away with the boundaries between them. We need disciplinary boundaries, if only so as to not always have to be contemplating everything all the time, right? Also, we need to have a way of staffing departments and hiring people, right? So that's another reason why we need these things. But what I do say is, and this is based on observation, the practices of unprefixed musicology and of ethnomusicology are converging.
Oh, yes, I know that.
Well, of course you do. We all know that. We all observe it. But very few have tried to explain it. And that's one of the things I tried to do toward the end of that last volume of my history. There are so many factors that enter into it, but it's a phenomenon I think we've all seen. The fact that people who do the unprefixed kind of musicology are no longer content with philology, no longer content only to study texts, and don't regard editing old musical texts as the be-all and end-all of the discipline, is evidence that we are now interested more in social context. We're interested in asking questions that can't be answered simply by looking at individual texts, or even by looking at the lives of individual composers. I mentioned before that people are both individuals and members of cohorts. We're now much more interested in the cohorts than we used to be. Well, that's the ethnomusicological point of view, right there. The idea that, and also the idea that, we as historical musicologists are looking at our tradition, or an anthropologist or a linguist would say we're taking the emic approach, whereas the ethnomusicologist takes the etic approach. No longer is it possible to say that the one takes the emic, the other takes the etic. I think that historical musicology is getting a lot more etic, and ethnomusicology is getting a lot more historical. So I guess you put emic and etic together, you get emetic, right? But you see what I mean? We observe it happening. Now I can't really tell you exactly why it's happening, because that's the kind of thing that requires a tremendous amount of contextualization. I have certain ideas which you can find in Oxford history, but those ideas are quite new.
In the Columbia Journal, the journal that Columbia students, former Columbia students, there's an interesting article about the medical school, which supports musicians. I mean, finds a relationship between music and medicine. And without going into the generalizations, which are interesting, not interesting, but there are some interesting findings. For instance, apropos the example we heard before, computer, not computer algorithms and so on, that according to the neuroscientists in this article, they all play piano, violin, and so on, and they have a better chance to get into medical school. It's an interesting sort of thing.
Well, a good argument to have your kids practice.
No, so the policies of empathy, sympathy, anticipation, and so on. But there are some real findings, and I find that one of the interesting findings, at least as reported, there is that people with music education and also played and so on, that their brains, in some areas, either in the motor area or in some other area of understanding, is more agile, or all kinds of examinations show that this is the case in locations in the brain and so on. But the most interesting thing, I think, of one of the findings is that the brain, so we are told in general, you probably follow also many brain studies. I do. But what they find in the medical school is that the brain altogether, somebody called it, is working on aesthetics. What does it mean, aesthetics? That the brain in all areas is looking for some kind of structure, or some kind of whole, or some kind of connection between things, and cannot come to any, let's call it understanding, it's not exactly understanding, of meaning, of significance, or give it any word you want to take, unless it can somehow organize it in some kind of understandable or comprehensive structure. Now, I find that this is extremely interesting, because when we talk about algorithms, about the brain, and I think of the Harari, to Harari and all that, that our whole makeup can be examined more or less eventually through algorithms. And the computer does very well, does it better than we do. I mean, we know less about ourselves than the computer eventually can tell us about that.
Not in my case.
No, but the main point is that I want to say that to understand sport, therefore I asked you the question before, how are we going to study that which what kind of holes are we looking for? What kind of relationship that would allow us to have the fact that we understand something, that we follow something. So the music that you treat with, I know the answer to that. I don't know where, indeed, this is about tomorrow, where are we going?
Well,
where
if you don't know, I should.
No, because we don't have the context. We don't have the context.
Yossi?
I think that what I would like to ask has a lot to do with what Rikus just now talking about. In what we read towards, before this event, there was a mention of, I think Professor Berger has mentioned, those that claim, of course they are on the edge of the spectrum, that you cannot really speak about musicology or science of thinking about music before the point in history where people started seeing music as a fabric, thinking about it in contexts of the past and genres, etc. So in a way, music history, they claim, start where people started mapping themselves, composers started mapping themselves in this fabric. And of course, music history starts much earlier than that point where this all way of thinking started, I think. But I wonder if you think that composers started composing differently, basically differently, when this awareness of being...
No, I think of course it did. Not only must it have, but I think you could observe that it did. You're talking about objectification, it seems to me. And not only, and of course that depends on literacy. I think that's the point that Carol Berger was making. So the first thing that literacy enables you to do is conceive of music as occupying space as well as time, right? And you can write it down and then say, here's the piece of music. So that's reification, objectification. And then when we begin to sort things into categories, and we are also sorting ourselves into those categories, are we not? I'm an opera composer, I'm a symphony composer, things like that. That's self-objectification. How could it not influence the way in which you do your job? Composers since the 19th century have all had an idea of where they fit into history. And for some of them, it has been a kind of mandate, hasn't it? That's the narrative of the new German school, that music, the history has mandated a certain kind of progress, and that if you are furthering that progress, you're a significant composer, and if you're not, then you're not. And so that, too, I think, has a tremendous impact on the way in which composers view their job, and of course,
as agents.
As agents, and therefore will have a tremendous impact on the product that you produce. If you believe that what Wagner did means you have to, in some sense, top Wagner, then it's going to have enormous influence on your musical style.
And if somebody would write the history of listening to music, do you think that there is a change the way we listen to music?
Well, that also has been written about historically. And it has also to do with objectification and with reification, with the so-called work concept, which is, again, a byproduct of Romanticism. My favorite illustration of it is a picture, actually. It's in the Ox. It's called the Andante from the Seventh Symphony, which of course is an allegretto made of the Seventh Symphony. And you see four men, I guess French man, was a French artist, all listening to a performance of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony. They're all like this, entranced by it. And they're all thinking, probably very different thoughts, but they're all relating to work in a way that nobody would have related to music before the 19th century, before music was imbued with transcendental significance by Romantic authority. So, sure.
I hope I can make this comment and not a short question and not long comments. You talk about paradigmatic shifts, like paradigmatic changes, the Thomas Kuhn term. And not only in terms of moving, we talk historically from old musicology to new musicology, but also from blurring the boundaries between musicology and ethnomusicology. And it actually reminded me what you wrote, your actually severe attack on Berger, when it talks about the separation that used to be between art music and entertaining music. And you take it, you very easily tear it apart, and you have ideas about how can you separate between art and entertainment, and you remind him that Scheherazade was actually the music that inspired Stravinsky, and Bolero is the music that we all learn orchestration with, and so on and so forth. And what I'm saying is that on the face of it, it seems as if you have a huge argument with Berger, but so maybe more philosophical, maybe more the way he writes it. But when you come down to it, the way you wrote your Oxford, the Ox, as you call it, Oxford History of Western Music, you are confined to art music. So you wrote about Reich, and you did write that the Reich maybe is on the on the boundary between art and entertainment, but you didn't write about Michael Jackson, you didn't write about Madonna. You actually confined yourself to what Berger wants. So
I thought I pointed that out to him, and he pointed it out to me.
Yeah, exactly. And I actually agree with you.
Well, this is why I don't really regard myself as such a radical historian of music. I was brought up very much committed to the traditional canon, just as Carol Berger was. But I think the time when you have to insist that the canon be the focus of our musicological interest is gone. It's past. The fact that I maintain an interest in it doesn't mean that I believe that it should be our interest, or that everybody should have an interest, and not other interests, which seemed to me what Carol Berger was saying. So that's why I had a big difference with it. It's not that I reject one kind of music or another as a subject for my own writing, but that I don't want to see that kind of thing legislated, whether by me or by anybody else. And by the way, Carol Berger and I have remained very good friends.
I have a little different question about the approach to rhetorics in the 16th century.
Approach to art?
To
rhetoric.
I know what I understood is that this is the common approach to analyzing the music of the 16th century and 17th century is mostly based on rhetoric figures.
Yes.
And I wanted your comment about other things besides rhetorics, if there are.
Well, the treatises of the time tend to talk about rhetoric, and that's when they begin to, isn't it? Burmeister and then Christoph Bernhard, and that's how it functioned, at least in my account. When it becomes something that is of sufficient interest to theorists that they begin to enunciate it overtly or explicitly, then it becomes part of the discourse. But I don't think that musical rhetoric begins at that point. I also don't think it's necessarily incumbent on us only to look at things the way in which contemporaneous theorists look at it. So I agree, or I don't know whether you're agreeing with this or not, but it seems to me that rhetoric becomes very relevant to the music of the late 16th century and the 17th century because the theorists begin talking about rhetoric, and they illustrate their discussions with actual pieces, whether by Orlando di Lasso or by Schutz later on. So it seems to be appropriate, therefore, to analyze it that way for the benefit of readers. But I, again, don't mean to limit the purview of the discussion to what the contemporaneous theorists say. I don't know, does that answer the question? Want to try again?
I was hoping you might have something to add.
Well, it's a long time since I did that part of the time. I don't think I do, not today.
Okay. My question is about narrative and responsibility. You stress very much the concept of narrative as something that distinguishes true history from a survey, but also from the act of criticism, which is concerned with making the canon and delimiting the canon. And then you seem to sometimes attribute things to the narrative as having certain demands. I included this because the narrative demanded that, or otherwise. And you admitted that you have one narrative and a different author would have. My question is about the status of the narrative, because it seems that at the very moment when you are constructing a narrative, you put yourself outside of history. You're only in relation to it, and you say maybe someone will come after me and will explain what I'm doing in the same way that I'm explaining different things. And so the question is, what responsibility what's the status of a narrative vis-a-vis an agent?
You're using the word narrative, I think, a little differently from the way I did. You're fastening, of course, on maybe the most pounced upon phrase in that whole introduction, where this is an attempt at a true history. And that, of course, looks so arrogant to say that. If I'm writing a true history, what are you writing? But it isn't that I was saying everybody else was writing a false history and I'm writing true history. What I meant was that I try to explain things. And the survey kind of thing where you try to explain things, the survey is where you'll read that the chanson emerged at a certain time. But that too is a narrative. They're all narratives as long as you're talking about describing events in sequence, that's a narrative. So what I was trying to do with that expression was not to say that I'm writing a narrative rather than, well, I don't know what the alternative would be, but I was attempting explanations in full consciousness that my explanations are fallible and inevitably incomplete. But I still think that historians have an obligation to attempt explanation, or else why even write a history? Yeah. So this is what I'm offering, and then always with the idea that you don't have to agree, but if you disagree, then you owe us a better version. Yeah. And that way, I don't believe that music makes progress, but I do believe that musicology makes progress. And that's the way it would happen. I'm not sure I've answered the question you asked.
No, I'm not sure I expressed myself correctly. I'll try to rephrase very, very shortly.
All right.
What do you believe, if at all, is the responsibility entailed in constructing a narrative vis-a-vis one's historical positioning and the moment
Well,
in the
I tried
historical
very hard
context
to
of-
make my own historical position clear by saying, you know, one of the things that people have singled out either for praise or for critique in the book is that I so often step out from behind the curtain and sort of tell you what I'm doing, you know? The reason why I felt it necessary to do that is because, yes, I also am somebody who lives in history. I am part of the history of my discipline. I want to define that place so that it can be fairly critiqued. I think that I very consciously avoid making the assumption that you seem to find in what I wrote, that I am taking myself out of history, making myself the exception to all the rest of what I talk about. I am very much aware that I have a certain historical position within the task of writing the history of music. And I acknowledge some of those things in the preface, but I also take time in various places to position myself vis-a-vis other narratives, especially in that last volume, where I was very much aware of running against the grain. But those attempts to explain what I'm doing are, I see them anyhow, as attempts to historicize myself, and thereby relativize myself. Not to say that I'm the voice from Mount Sinai, you know, and that these are the tablets of the law, but that this is my version, and I challenge you to either, you know, accept it or find some better way of putting it. So, go ahead and do that.
Richard, that was a great introduction to my question, because we won't let you get out from here without saying something about Russia. And in a way, my question was, first of all, because in the public there are many prominent scholars who deal with that subject, but from the Western point of view, talking about your agency, your positioning within this, I wouldn't say narrative, but constant dialogue between different minds about the musical past. You have a very prominent role in bringing Russia in the West. And as a very young student, you were one of the, correct me, and maybe incorrect, but one of the first students to go to the Soviet Union and study there. Did that experience in your life change not only the subjects that you were dealing with, but in a way was a conscious, or I don't want to psychoanalyze you, but some internal drive to challenge already as a very young man that narrative by bringing back a music that remained in the peripheries?
No, it had no impact at all. No, obviously, of course. And yes, it also played its very important part in relativizing my view about my discipline. I was very strongly advised not to write a dissertation on Russian music when it came time to choose. In fact, you can go back to some antediluvian issue of, one of a printing of, it used to be called the Helen Hewitt catalog, then it was the Hewitt Atkins, then Atkins, and now I don't know what it's called, but AMS maintains, the American Musicological Society maintains a list of all the dissertations that have been proposed and written. You know, the list proposed is much longer than the list written. And in some ancient issue of that list, you'll find me with the Masses of Heinrich Isaac as my subject, which was a very kosher subject in the 1960s or early 70s when I was getting ready to write a dissertation. But, and this is a long story, I've actually told the story in the introduction to a book called On Russian Music. I learned to my great amazement, or my whole family learned to our great amazement, that we had many relatives in the Soviet Union that we didn't know we had. We learned this in the 1950s. And I began to correspond with them, and I had a great desire to meet them. And I learned Russian so I could write to them. That was my reason for learning the Russian language. I conceived of a kind of cynical plot to get myself over to Russia by announcing a dissertation topic on a Russian subject, and then getting a Fulbright scholarship to go there. And it meant not Fulbright only, but IREX fellowship. Anyway, I changed my focus for purely ulterior purposes, to go to Russia and meet my relatives. And one of the lucky breaks I've had in my career is that I eventually actually became interested in the subject of my dissertation.
So you see that Bruno Latour has a point, that sometimes turns in culture or in history
Yeah.
to do with the inconsequent.
Oh, I don't deny that conditions have a tremendous impact.
Yeah.
I just don't want to call them agents, that's all. So, yes, I wrote a dissertation on Russian music, and of course I became defensive about it. Because people, said, you'll never get a job writing about, especially since I picked for my subject not the great Russian composers, but 3 Russian composers that I think only Marina Ritserov has heard of. Among everybody in this room except me, Alexander Serov, Alexander Nargomishky, Cesar Cui you've heard of because he's in the 5, yeah? But he's number 5 in the 5. So those were the composers I wrote about. I won't get a job, I was told. Well, I had the last laugh. But it's because I felt, one of the things I wanted to do was sell the idea that writing about Russian music can be of interest to people in the West who are interested in musicology. So even in my dissertation, I tried very hard to tie the musical works that I was writing about to larger cultural issues involving Russia, and of course also involving the kind of figures that everybody was interested in, like most prominently Wagner. So to the extent that I was able to make people interested in that field, I did something to further that broadening of the purview of musicology. And then since I was becoming genuinely fascinated with all of this subject matter, I continued to work in it, and always with that objective. And I was not alone after a while, not only because I had pupils who wanted to work on it, but because others began to also write about Russian music. And it wasn't just because of that the purview of musicology became so much broader. I can't think of anything that would not be an acceptable dissertation topic now. Can you? Except maybe the kind of thing we did write about in the 1960s. But even that would be acceptable, it seems to me. It seems to me that now we don't make that judgment. This is a good dissertation topic, this isn't. But in the 1960s, anything that was later than 1800 and east of Vienna, or west of the Azores, or, you just didn't write about it. So yeah. What started off as a purely pragmatic choice became a program. And I started trying to, exert some pressure on the discipline.
And you influenced the narrative.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And then, I had a predecessor who I really worshipped from afar, Gerald Abraham. He was the first English-speaking or Anglophone musicologist who wrote a lot about Russian music. And I had, him as a president. And I also saw something that he was able to do that inspired me and maybe made me more inclined to accept the opportunity when it was presented to me of writing that long history of music. He wrote a book called I think it's the Oxford Concise History of Music. Gerald Abraham was the editor of what was called the New Oxford History of Music, the 10 volumes, NOHM. Never really made it as an authoritative was actually a big failure.
He wrote the Oxford History.
But he was the editor,
I know.
and then he wrote something called the Concise Oxford History of Music, which everybody thought was just a condensation of the new Oxford History of Music, but it wasn't. It was a completely new work, and he, having studied Russian music for many, many years, and not only Russian music, but all kinds of Eastern European music, he also knew Polish music and Czech music, and he began to integrate all of that into the general narrative, and he was the first to do it. And I saw how much it benefited. Of course, I had a parochial interest in that music, but I also thought that other readers would also see that to widen the purview means to make all the familiar stuff really meaningful. So that was an important precedent for me.
Another question. I want to ask you about your final volume. How it is that you made decisions about whether to diverge or not diverge into different genres or different world music and their effect on the music in Western music.
Yes, well, what I intended to do, or what I thought I was doing, and you will tell me whether it was what I was doing, was to report on other genres of music, other kinds of music than the basic literary tradition that we call classical, when that kind of music began to impinge significantly on the literary tradition. So in the 1960s, popular music became an inescapable influence on art music. And whereas you could argue that jazz was an influence on the composers of the 1920s, and I did report that, when Stravinsky used jazz, Stravinsky wasn't really being influenced by jazz. Stravinsky was colonizing jazz. Stravinsky was writing music that had a little jazzy quality from a standpoint of incorporating this minor genre of music into the major discourse. In the 1960s, when people began, there were actually composers who were writing music within the literary tradition who had actually been brought up on popular music and did not make that distinction any longer. And you could hear it in their work. And I think that the minimalist composers were the first important group of whom that could be said, and who were incorporating elements of popular music, including elements of their instrumentation. So their actual sound was the sound of, they were using the same instruments, and amplified instruments, and farfisa organs, and their music sounded like the sounds of rock music of those days. So their music was incorporating that music in a much more fundamental way that had a big structural influence on the music, as well as a superficial influence on the, the sound of the morphological vocabulary, if you want to put it that way, as Stravinsky might have taken from jazz. Then the minimalists and their successors, many of them were really interested in non-Western genres, Asian music of various styles, African music. Steve Reich, who actually went to Africa to study drumming, and his music shows that influence in a way that, again, is no longer the kind of patronizing or colonialist view, but an important stylistic influence. It seemed to me that the difference had also to do with media. The 20th century was, of course, the century in which there was recording. And so music of all types was simultaneously available to all people. Now, of course, it's so much more available. You can find anything in 2 seconds on YouTube. But if you wanted to, you could listen to music from all over the world, no matter where you were in the 1960s. And so everything became an influence. Old music, new music, Steve Reich used to say, I'm interested in Perotinus and Stravinsky, nothing in between. No interest in the so-called bourgeois classics, as he put it. So that was my criterion. So I began talking about popular music in a detailed way only when I got to the 1960s. And I made a point of saying, look how late this is coming in the narrative. And that's so as to say, it isn't because I was snobbishly ignoring it up until now, but because it wasn't available the way it was starting in the 1960s. You know, you may not find this believable, but people of my generation, many of us were raised in a pop-free bubble. We never heard that music, except a little bit when we went to summer camp, you know? And everybody's playing on their radios, but I tried as hard as I could to. I was a little academic snob, but it's no music. Unlike some of my colleagues, I never did try to make it up, you know, and become expert on everything. I don't think I could. But even with some of the people who did become experts in everything, you can sort of tell when you read their work where they know the music and where they're reading secondary sources, you know? I didn't want to do that. So, yeah, I have that limitation. But where that music became an important element of the music I was interested in and couldn't be avoided if you were to make an adequate explanation, I did try to acquaint myself with it.
Just one last thing.
Hi. I'm Mike Beckerman. I studied with Professor Taruskin at Columbia.
Before any of you were born.
And before you were born, and so I'm honored to be here for the celebrations of the 10th anniversary,
my
10th anniversary of Richard's book. Well, the point, I guess, was you've heard the expression standing on the shoulders of giants. At Columbia, it was more like getting into fistfights with giants. But we learned better that way, I think. And I'd like to talk. Right. I'd like to talk just a little bit, maybe about some of the context around that time, which, for me, provide sort of a really extraordinary credibility for this volume, over and above maybe some other things. When I first came to Columbia, Richard was conducting a choir called the Collegium, which was famous for going through tirelessly a vast repertory with 4-hour rehearsals, people collapsing, and that
6-hour concerts.
6-hour concerts. And so, you know, Richard had a hands-on command of that repertoire, which people who did their dissertations in those areas didn't have, which was extraordinary. He was also active as a composer shortly before that time and had written some really interesting pieces. In addition to that, he was performer. First cello and then viol da gamba, and also went through vast amounts of repertoire. In addition to that, of course, he was an extremely active teacher on 3 levels. On the undergraduate level, undergraduate majors, where he taught core courses and went through this repertory painstakingly in the Baroque, classical, romantic period, but also earlier. I don't know if you taught the 20th century sequence, but you probably did.
I think I taught all of them eventually, yeah.
And I think one thing which I sort of admire so much about his writing is that he also taught a course which all of us taught called Music Humanities, where in addition to everything else, you had to make this subject not only comprehensible, but extremely exciting to people who hadn't had much experience with it. And Richard was a master.
Not very excitable, I have to say.
Richard was a master teacher of that. Now, in addition to that, he was also a conductor. I did my dissertation on Janacek, and one of the first things I heard when I came to Columbia was Richard conducting Janacek's Capriccio. So he's not merely somebody who has, as we would say, an academic interest in this subject. He has, hands down, the most comprehensive, hands-on experience with this music of anybody I've ever encountered. And I've encountered a lot of people. So, you know, and this kind of thing radiates out of the volume and gives it, I think, a kind of credibility that other volumes don't have. I want to make a couple more points about that time. One of the stories that Richard told me, and I hope he doesn't mind me repeating it, and I won't repeat it at length, was his class was asked by my advisor, Edward Lipton, when he was in a seminar, to do a translation of a German article. I think it was by Peter Winter or something like that.
By Kreuer.
Oh, by Kreuer. And he came in the next week or something expecting Lippmann to say anything, and all Lippmann said was, well, if you want to check your translation, go to Paul Henry Lang's Music and Western Civilization.
because his translation's pretty good.
So there it was. I mean, music in Western civilization was supposed to be an entirely original volume. And basically what the professor did by having his students translate that was exposing that volume as a scissors and paste job. And so I think if he had ever had the idea from that, at least from that moment on, the last thing Richard ever wanted to do was anything like a scissors and paste job. It had to have the kind of integrity and not be sort of something with clay feet like music in Western civilization. I'm also thinking of 3 short guys with mustaches at Columbia around that same period. One was the editor of Musical Quarterly, another, Tom Baker, was a Wagner scholar, and then Peter Schubert, who ended up in McGill, was there. And the 3 of them, at least at one point, made a kind of a pact that if you were really a great scholar, you would never finish anything. You would never write an article because the act of committing something to paper was already such a compromise from the Olympian notions you had in your mind. And so I think Richard also had to struggle with that environment, which is what is it in the end that's worth saying? How do you get by that? How do you have the kinds of standards that the 3 of them did and at the same time turn out stuff that has the integrity that's not a scissors and paste job? So I think a couple of ways. Richard has an absolutely prodigious memory. I remember I wrote a few articles in the Times, and then I sent him another version of them, and he looked at them and was able to point out quickly the 2 sentences I changed in this article. So I mean, that kind of memory that allows you not only to have the hands-on control of the material, but to remember it and synthesize it. Which is, I think, really an extraordinary thing. And an extraordinary, he's made a historical impression in many different ways. There are people on at least 4 continents, I'm not sure about Antarctica, who, when they hear the words bon appetit, answer the word Ginsberg. This is a well-known joke, which I will, for a small fee, tell you afterwards if you don't know it. But the point is that Richard has a wonderful sense of humor. And even though he's not trying to write a funny book, the kind of skepticism and distance and irony and not taking yourself too seriously, which is the province of the humorist, is also something that's an essential ingredient of that book. The final thing I'll say, and one of the greatest things I think I learned when I took classes with Richard, was actually watching him listen to music. Because he listened to music in a way that was really sort of so wonderful and wonderfully involved and engaged that you listening to the music were also watching him listen to it. And when I read about music that he writes and that, I can see him listening. And so I know that not only does he have a kind of hands-on integrity because he knows the material, because even as unfashionable as it may be to say today, he loves the material. And whether it's still an open question how much you can say about music you don't love. And I don't think it's to take up at the moment. But I think that he's not writing a love letter to Western music, but his love for it shines through in a way that also animates the volume in a way that's quite powerful.
Small fee, how much I paid.
Okay, so I want to thank first the audience for the great questions and for the great answers. And luckily this is not the end of things. Tomorrow we have a full day of more interesting things to come, including Berkeley and Taruskin. And so we have a full day of choosing, of history, of present and future, and you're all invited to take part of it tomorrow. Thank you.